Let's take a look at development. Now, back before we were born, there are 3 different developmental stages. You can see those listed here: germinal, embryonic, and fetal. If you look at these 3 different time periods, you can look at the number of weeks involved, or you could also look at what has and has not developed yet in an individual. Now, starting with the germinal period, gets its name because in this time period is which the 3 germinal layers develop. It's the endoderm, ectoderm, and mesoderm, which have been discussed before. So in these first 2 weeks, these embryonic tissues are going to develop, and those are very important layers because all the adult tissues will be derived from those. Now, after week 2, in weeks 2 to 8, this is the embryonic period. This is the time in which every organ and organ system develops. So at the end of just 8 weeks, and we're talking about long before an individual is born, every organ and organ system in the body is present. But of course, it needs to develop and grow some more before the individual can survive on their own. And this embryonic period is the time period in which most birth defects occur. Some type of outside chemical or some other influence gets to these rapidly dividing cells at this time, they can cause damage. Then lastly, we have the fetal period. Everything after week 8 up until the time of birth. So you're generally looking at about the last 30 weeks or so. And this is the time in which the organ systems are still growing and developing. You can also see down here at the bottom a couple of different ways to estimate the age of an unborn child. Now, traditionally, the clinical age was used. The time from the mother's last menstrual period. But remember, that time from menses to ovulation, there's always a 2-week difference. So post-ovulatory age is always a more accurate means of estimating the age of the unborn child. This will always be 14 days less than what the clinical is. Going to fertilization. Look at some of the major steps involved with these 2 gametes, reproductive cells coming together and forming a single cell once again. Start off with the sperm cell. They have to reach the oocyte. And remember, if fertilization is going to happen, it must happen way back deep in the uterine tubes, way back close to the ovaries. Again, reason being, when that oocyte is released, it only lives for 1 day. That's about a 6-day trip through those uterine tubes to the uterus. So fertilization has to happen way back close to the ovaries, or the oocyte would never survive long enough. If that sperm cell is going to get to that oocyte, it has to get through this protective barrier of epithelial cells called the corona radiata. Recall back looking at the anatomy of the sperm cell. It has a little package of digestive enzymes right at the tip of it called the achromosome. So if a sperm cell reaches that barrier of epithelial cells around that oocyte, that pack of digestive enzymes will dissolve the little protein connections that bind them together and allow that sperm cell to penetrate that barrier. First sperm cell that reaches that oocyte causes a rapid depolarization of the oocyte cell membrane. This is called the fast block to polyspermy. You need a way to repel from that oocyte any more than one incoming sperm cell. Remember, all these oocytes will always have an X chromosome as far as that 23rd chromosome. Female just has XX there with diploid cells, so an X is all that can be passed on. Male will have either an X or a Y. That's why it is the male that determines the gender of any child. So once those 2 cells meet, the oocyte rapidly depolarizes. That'll repel any other incoming sperm cells. Depolarizations happen very quickly, so that's called the fast block to polyspermy. That oocyte soon afterwards will release calcium, and water will follow it. And the oocyte will actually shrink just a little bit as it loses that water. Now that'll form a fluid-filled barrier around the oocyte called the paravitelline space. And that will also help to repel any other incoming sperm cells. This one here is called the slow block to polyspermy. At this time, meiosis will be completed. Now you've got all the genetic material from both the gametes, both the reproductive cells. They will fuse together to form a single nucleus, and now we have the zygote. Very first original cell that we all start off as. After about a day after this fertilization, that zygote is going to start to divide. These rapidly dividing cells are called pluripotent cells. These are cells which have the ability to develop into all the different body tissues that we have. Those are the stem cells you hear about. Once these cells reach 12 in number, cell mass will be called a morula, and soon after those cells will develop a fluid-filled center, and it's called a blastocyst. Cloning is just simply the removal of the nucleus of the zygote and replacing it with the nucleus from another individual. You place that zygote with that new nucleus in it back into the female, let those cells continue to develop. You'll develop an individual which is genetically identical to the donor. Look also at twins. You may have heard of monozygotic and dizygotic. These are also called identical and fraternal twins. With monozygotic, this occurs from one single fertilization. So you fertilize these two cells, get the sperm and the oocyte together. The zygote is formed, and sometimes that zygote splits and two individuals develop. So since they came from one fertilization, they do have the same genetics. So those are identical twins. Dizygotic or fraternal come about from two separate fertilizations. So there were two separate oocytes and two separate sperm cells. These individuals here are no more genetically identical than brothers and sisters born years apart or whatever. And where the monozygotic must be of the same gender, the dizygotic twins do not. Around day 7, that blastocyst is going to reach that inner wall of the uterus and start to burrow into that epithelial wall. There's an inner layer of epithelial cells on the inside of that uterus. This process is called implantation. Soon after that, placenta will start to develop. That placenta, remember, is an organ develops at the time of pregnancy and keeps the mother and baby's blood separated. This is why their blood types do not have to be the same. Back in the blood chapter, there was a discussion on how there could be a mixing of the blood types, and if the blood types are not compatible, there could be a transfusion reaction. It could lead up to death of the baby, but again, usually this does not happen. Now, the placenta is a non-antigenic layer. No proteins will be expressed in this layer. Since half the genetic material came from the father, this layer started to express proteins. They were recognized as foreign, and the mother's immune system would destroy them. So we got this non-antigenic layer called the centrotrophoblast. It's going to burrow into the wall of the uterus, going after the blood supply. If these cells are going to continue to develop into a person, they're going to need a lot of nutrients. Those nutrients are found in the mother's blood. And eventually, as that wall is burrowed out more and more, there'll be a large pool of the mother's blood formed, and fetal arterioles will penetrate that pool. And of course, there'll be the swapping of materials back and forth. Look at this picture right here. We start off with this oocyte, and here you can see this protective barrier of epithelial cells all the way around it. Sperm cells have to get through that layer. It's where that chromosome becomes important. And again, when a sperm cell first touches the oocyte, there's a rapid depolarization of the oocyte. That's the fast block. Then later it releases water, forming a water barrier, and that's the slow block. So there we will have these two individual haploid cells with their genetic material fusing together to form the zygote. Then the replication occurs, and here's the morula, as we mentioned, and the blastocyst off to the right. And here's the implantation, usually somewhere around day 6 or 7 is when it will occur.